Peace family, this is Davon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, grassroots political think tank, revolutionary Pan-African nationalist, unapologetically advocate for the interests of the masses of Black people. This is our second installment of our 2026 Streets of the Statehouse podcast, where we give people an insight into the nature of the political work that we do, in Annapolis during the 90-day Maryland General Assembly. For those who aren't familiar, Maryland's legislature is in session from January to April for 90 days. That is where laws are made, and we spend a lot of time in our state's capital navigating and pushing legislation that is in our collective interest. What I'll do, because this podcast, we're going to focus on a couple of really specific items. If there are issues in our broader legislative agenda that you want to familiarize yourself with, I recommend that you go to the first episode that we did a couple of weeks ago, where I lay out pretty comprehensively some of the things that are on our legislative agenda and some of the things that we'll be working on. What I want to do today, there are three things I want to do today during this live stream. The first is to shout out Lawrence Grand Prix, our political commentator, who actually testified in Annapolis today against the bill. That's one of Sinclair Broadcasting's bills that would essentially limit the ability to make public investments in nonprofits. And so we see the attack on Black-led organizations. You've heard us talk about that on a variety of different our platforms. You'll see his testimony in the next few days posted on our site, so you can see that work. And there are two other bills in that regard that we're going to testify against. Again, pushing back against the war that Sinclair Broadcasting is waging against Black-led organizations. That actually empties into the second thing I want to talk about, which is a piece of legislation that we're working with Delegate Cheryl Pasteur and Senator Charles Sidnor. It's a bill that focuses on reentry led by those who are formerly incarcerated. So one of the things that we worked on last session and supporting, the Second Look Coalition and a variety of other organizations is the Second Look Act, which allows for those who've been incarcerated for more than 20 years to be able to petition a judge to have their charges, their convictions evaluated to see if they'd be eligible for resentencing. Knowing about the way that prosecutors were in some instances still continue to be overzealous and overcharging, which has drawn so many people into the criminal justice system that would otherwise be served outside of the criminal justice system. In addition to undermining the ability for those who are truly reformed, who did commit whatever act that they were convicted of, and have decided to be a positive force in our community. And so with the Second Look Act passing, providing more pathways for people to come out from behind the walls, we think it's important for people to have resources, people who are themselves formerly incarcerated, to be able to go behind the walls and provide some of that support that'll be necessary as folks transition back outside of the walls. And so we have a bill with the two legislators I just mentioned a few moments ago that will require the Department of Corrections to establish a protocol that would require them to collaborate with organizations led by those formerly incarcerated to provide programming and support behind the walls, again, to help people transition back into society. And one of the things that I want to note, in addition to the importance of just looking out for our sisters and brothers that are coming out from behind the walls, I want to also make it a point to note that it has been, when you look at the work of violence prevention in Baltimore over the last several years, much of that work has been led by those that are formerly incarcerated. And in fact, many of those that have come out of prison and have come back into the community have been central figures in addressing the violence that we see in Baltimore. And a lot of the historic declines in violence and in homicides in Baltimore, I think a large chunk of credit goes to those networks of those who are formerly incarcerated. So we see this particular effort of providing opportunities for people who are formerly incarcerated to go behind the walls and to work with those that are incarcerated as they transition out, I think provides an important pipeline for folks who are interested, who have turned their life around and want to find positive ways for them to contribute. It is a pipeline for helping to establish, firm up, and strengthen those networks that are addressing themselves to violence and homicide in our community. So that is a piece of legislation that's being heard in the Senate tomorrow. I'll be in Annapolis testifying on behalf of that with, other folks that are going to be down there to support. If you're interested in supporting, look out for action alerts that we'll put out that'll provide you an opportunity, if that's a particular issue you're interested in, that'll provide you an opportunity to write to your legislator or other ways to support and help to move that piece of legislation along. And that bill is HB 108, Senate Bill 61. And again, Senate Bill 61 is being heard in the Senate tomorrow. All right, so those are the things that I wanted to handle at the top. The majority of our conversation this evening is going to center around one of our biggest legislative priorities. It's something that we've been working on for many years and that others have been working on longer than us. So former Senator Jill Carter, when she was in the House of Delegates, she was elected in 2002, took her seat in the legislature in 2003, and she's been introduced. She was one of the first people that we know of who introduced a bill when she was in the House of Delegates 15 years ago that would eliminate the practice of automatically charging youth as adults. And every year that came up against strong opposition, particularly the law enforcement establishment. So Fraternal Order of Police, the Maryland States Attorneys Association, the police chiefs and sheriffs, a variety of different elements of the law enforcement establishment made it for many years almost impossible for anything like that to make any headway. And one of the things that has happened over the past several years is there's been major shifts in leadership, right? Starting with when I first started doing legislative advocacy, Mike Miller and Mike Bush were the Senate president and Speaker of the House, respectively, two old white men. Mike Miller being the stronger arm than the other, but both of them fairly conservative in terms of the kinds of policies that would be able to move through their chamber. So the kind of legislation that went out, we'll explain the automatic charge youth as adults in a few moments, but I want to lay just the political landscape that at that period of time, when Mike and Mike were the presiding officers, these kinds of policies were dead on arrival. Then we had shifts in leadership. Bush and Miller passed away. You have Senate President Bill Ferguson. Then you have Adrian Jones, who became Speaker after Bush actually passed away, I believe, like the day before the last day of session in 2019. And so that opened up opportunities for more progressive kinds of policies to be able to be moved. And so policies like the Child Interrogation Protection Act, a piece of legislation that requires that if law enforcement engage in a custodial interrogation of a young person, that a parent has to be notified and they have to consult with an attorney before they can participate in a custodial interrogation to protect young people from the power imbalance, the intimidation they may feel from law enforcement that might elicit incriminating information, right, unknowingly, right, in ways that land our young people behind bars or in trouble with the system in ways that are needless. And I'm sure many people are aware of the When They See Us documentary. So there are lots of people that were inspired by seeing that story and wanted to ensure that young people have the protections they need, right, from being, giving false confessions, signing things without having an attorney say they don't have to sign things, so that legislation was supported. And we were able to get that passed back in 2022. Right. So progress has been and there were other pieces of legislation around juvenile justice where progress is being made, kind of chipping away at the barriers to moving this policy. Recently, there was an election of a new Speaker of the House, Speaker Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, and there were some changes in the leadership in the House committees that in many respects has drastically changed the power differential on this issue, because the previous chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House himself was a prosecutor. He works for the Anne Arundel Prosecutor's Office. And I've spoken about that and written about that in many occasions about how that influenced his policy worldview in a way that was predisposed against the kind of things that we were pushing for. We have a new chair of the Judiciary Committee. It's a sister named Sandy Bartlett, who is a delegate out of Anne Arundel County. And she actually was the House sponsor of the Child Interrogation Protection Act back when it passed. And so as she assumed the chairmanship over the past couple of weeks of that committee, she announced at the rally that the Office of the Public Defender of Maryland hosted last week that she would be the House sponsor of a bill that the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee chair sponsored last session on this issue. So both chairs of the respective committees in the House and Senate, both of them are Black, are sponsoring legislation that would change the practice of automatically charging youth as adults, which is a tremendous breakthrough legislatively, given the history that I described earlier in terms of the barriers of moving this policy along. And so with this shift, with kind of a more favorable legislative environment for this issue to be able to be addressed, we think it's important to get as much information out there to the community as possible about the nature of this practice of youth being charged as adults. And it's something that a lot of people still don't know about, right? There's still people who contact me and say they didn't know that this was a practice, but Maryland is one of the few states that engages in this practice where there are 33 charges where a young person is charged as an adult and put into the adult prison system. And then there are numerous kids that suffer as a result of being put in the adult prison system where they don't have any entitlement to education, no entitlement to services. And so what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to bring on some guests who I've worked with in many capacities in the past that will talk more in depth about what the practice is, because we've talked about it, we've given out information, but I really want this podcast to be one where we can actually go in depth and give people kind of the depth of information they need so they understand the issue and understand why it's so important. So with that, I want to invite to the stage Tiara Hawks, Bobby Marvin Holmes to the stage. Appreciate y'all for joining me this evening. How y'all feeling this evening?
Good. How are you?
Stronger. I'm good. I'm good. I'm glad y'all can join me. So if we can do just a quick introductions. I'll start with Tiara and then Bobby. Just quick introductions. Just talk about yourself, your professional work, and your relationship to this issue.
Okay. Tiara Hawks, Esquire. I am a juvenile attorney with the Maryland Office of the Public Defender in Baltimore County. Service in Baltimore County, but as you all know, a lot of the kids from Baltimore County are also Baltimore City youth as well. I've been doing this work for about 6 years now. I'm in a specialty unit where we handle both juvenile cases in juvenile court, but we also handle juvenile charges adults. So very invested in this work and happy to explain and talk about the process.
Thank for having me, Devon. Really appreciate it, brother, for this conversation. As you heard, I'm Bobby Marvin Holmes, licensed clinical social worker in the state of Maryland. Also owner of Son of a Dream Services and Multimedia Resources, which focus on the healthy development and social well-being of Black men and boys. I'm also advisory council member with the Baltimore Rites of Passage Initiative, focused on African-centered rites of passage for Black men and boys. As it relates to this particular topic, I am contracted as a panel social worker with the Maryland Office of Public Defender. In that role, I collaborate with public defenders supporting a case for youth charged as adult in the state of Maryland. I work in various jurisdictions across the state, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, with the good sister Tiara, Prince George's County, etc.
All right. So that's really important. I think important context for the listeners, because, these are folks that directly are engaging the process itself. And so I'll ask Tiara for you to go first. And just for, as an attorney who works on these issues, the way that you do, can you just lay out for the people, like, what does it even mean for a young person to be charged as adults? What is the process? And some of the things that you heard me say in the beginning, in terms of the challenges, if you could say a little bit about how that plays itself out in the process.
Okay. Perfect. So basically what happens when a juvenile is charged as an adult, what that means is the police believe that their case should be charged in an adult jurisdiction. And based on the laws and legislation that we have right now, if you're 14 or older and you're charged with murder or first degree rape, you can be automatically charged in adult court, which means that your case starts off in adult court. If you're 16 and older and you're charged with some of the more serious offenses, as they would label it, first degree assault, robbery with a weapon, or even just a simple handgun possession, you're in a car and someone has a handgun or it's in the car and they're saying it's in your reach, you can be charged as an adult. And when that happens, you follow the same process for if you were an adult and you were charged as for a crime. you're arrested, you're taken to the precinct. There you go to the commissioner. The commissioner can release you, of course, or put you on some type of pre-trial release type of situation, or you can be detained, you can be held. If you're held, the next day you will have a bail review. Hopefully it's not a Friday, because then you got to wait till Monday. But you would go to the bail review, and the district court judge would decide if you are deemed to go to a juvenile facility, or if you're going to stay in an adult facility, or of course they can release you. If you're released, you will probably be on some type of pretrial release, the same type that an adult would be on. You could be on total home detention, which can be a huge restriction. If you're a juvenile, you're used to going to school and going to basketball and doing all these things, and now you're confined to your home. The district court judge could say, no, you need to stay at the detention center with the adults, and you would go back to, in Baltimore County, you would go to BCDC, but it would be whatever detention center is in that county. You would go back there and you would be held there. The other option is they can move you to a juvenile facility, which is the option that we all want. We don't want any kids to be held in any adult detention facilities at all. So the district court judge will make that decision. Now, there is a rule, Maryland rule, I want to say it's 4-223. And basically it says that juveniles shall be held in a juvenile facility if they're pending transfer. And transfer is basically the process in which a defense attorney would file a motion for the case to be held in the case to be in the juvenile jurisdiction. So that's what the transfer process is. It's basically the defense saying, like, hey, Your Honor, we know this case is being charged in adult court, but we believe that the case should actually be in juvenile court, and we file what's called a transfer motion. Now, this rule says that juveniles shall be held there unless the court makes a finding that they're at a risk to themselves or to someone else, or if the Department of Juvenile Services say they don't have room, which they never say. They're always going to have room. There's always going to be, it might be a wait list, but, as soon as they get someone out, they're going to get that person in. So they never say that they don't have room. Or if they're released on bond, that would be the only option. So essentially, all judges should really be putting juveniles in juvenile facilities. But if that doesn't happen and they're held in an adult facility, there's been a lot of reports out about what's going on in those adult facilities, that kids are not being held out of sight and sound from adults, that the conditions are not well, they're not good, they're not getting proper heat and food and all of those things. So you have to Google some of that to get all of that stuff. But some of those reports are true. And the conditions that the kids are being held in are not appropriate for juveniles to be held in. And they're held there until if the public defender gets assigned, or if they get a private attorney. When I get assigned a case, I automatically look at it. I say, where is this kid? Are they at the jail, or are they at home? Where are they? And if they are at the jail, then I would file that motion that I talked about, where we would first transfer to juvenile court, and then I would also file a motion for them to be held in a juvenile facility pending their transfer hearing. And the reason why I want them at the juvenile facility is it's a better place. It's where they're supposed to be. They're not supposed to be over at the jail. The jail does not offer any type of therapeutic services. The educational component of it, they have the ability to refuse to go. Some kids are scared to go out of their cells. They're often held on 23-1, which means that they're in their cell 23 hours out the day, and then they have 1 hour out to take a shower, make a phone call, do all the things, mainly because the jails are trying to comply with the out of sight and sound with the adults, but they don't have the housing facilities to actually house these kids away from adults. They don't have the staff to actually effectuate what they need to get done. So essentially, I filed that motion to get them to a juvenile facility because that's where we want them to be. And most circuit court judges in Baltimore County are granting those motions because they do say that it says shall. It says shall. And the DJS facilities are equipped to handle kids that are charged with some of the most serious charges. And they've done it in the past, and they'll continue to do it. And they've said that on the record. This whole process, because once a case is in the adult system and we have to have a transfer hearing, where I would argue for the case to stay to go to juvenile court, and the state's attorney will argue for the case to stay in adult court. There's reports that's requested from the Department of Juvenile Services. We have evaluations that are completed. The court gives the appropriate time for that to happen. They usually give 3 months for that. Then once we get to that stage, we make a decision about whether or not we're going to have a transfer hearing at all. Sometimes the state's attorney decides that this case should have started off in juvenile court to begin with, or I don't have victims that are available, or this was overcharged. There's a lot of things that can happen between the time that we actually had their first court appearance to resolve the case, and it actually ends up back in juvenile court. If we do have to have a transfer hearing, then we have to use the court schedule to schedule in a transfer hearing, which can often happen months down the road from that. So when I first get a case and I tell a parent, like, this is going to be a process, we should be prepared for 6 to 9 months for your child to be detained. And so that's a really big reality for us as adults, 6 to 9 months. We're like, oh, okay, that doesn't seem like that long. That's half a year. But for a juvenile whose life has totally been interrupted, and they're forced to be in these situations, a lot of kids who don't really deserve to be there, this can be a huge amount of time and a huge disruption to their life and to their development. And then once we get to the transfer process and we have the hearing, if it's granted, the case goes back down to juvenile court, and then it's adjudicated adjudicated there. We basically decide what's going to happen at the juvenile level. But if not, then the case stays in adult court. At the public defender's office, we follow the case regardless of what happens. So I could be in adult court with them. They keep the same attorney, and they could be facing some type of potential jail time, some type of penalty for the case. If it's a simple case such as handgun, they may get probation. So at the end of all of this, they sat in jail for 9 months, and then they're released on adult probation. Then most judges know that juveniles aren't going to be able to do, because a lot of the juveniles who are in the system have a lot of mental health. I'm sure Bobby is going to talk about this, but there's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of mental health issues and things that are going on with them, which kind of makes probation not appropriate for them. And it makes it very difficult for them to do the conditions of probation, when all we really could have done was just transfer it back down to juvenile court, where they had the support and the guidance that they need from a probation in the juvenile system. But that's essentially what can happen, what happens now. In reference to auto charging, one other thing I want to add in is, when we're talking about automatic charging, there is a process that currently exists now. It's called a discretionary waiver, where a state's attorney can take a case that's currently in juvenile court and request that it be waived up to adult court. And that's if you're 15 and older and charged with any crime. So the state's attorney on their own desire can say, yes, I want this case to go up to adult court, and we argue in front of the judge, similar to a transfer. How we'll argue for the case to go back down to juvenile court. In a waiver hearing, we're arguing for the case to stay in juvenile court. So there is a process that already exists where a case can start off in juvenile court and it can stay in juvenile court, and let us argue and let the judge, a juvenile judge, make a decision about whether or not this case should go to adult court or to juvenile court. They're the ones that are most qualified. They hear most of the cases. They know our youth. Well, I like to think they know our youth, but they know our youth and they know what they face. And so they're the ones who are trained and are supposed to have the expertise to make those types of decisions. So we don't really need auto charging, because we already have a process where the state's attorney can use and follow the same type of provisions without having our kids exposed to the adult facilities, to the adult process in general, and to just go through all of that when they really don't need to. So I'll end on that.
Yep, and quick follow up on that. So in a world where all of them start in where we're able to change the policy, and all start in the juvenile system, just real quick, narrate a little bit how that changes the process and why that would be favorable.
So it would be favorable because when they're detained, they will stay in a juvenile facility. They would never touch the adult facility at all. And so once you are in a juvenile facility with juveniles your age, you would go to school. You could be provided any mental health services that you need. You would not face the fear of being in an adult facility, being exposed to that type of environment. Typically, the process would be shorter, because in juvenile court for just a regular case, it takes 30 days. You have to have your case resolved in 30 days or 60 days with good cause. So that would eliminate the time process. Of course, that means that the state's attorney and the defense attorney would have to be prepared to argue something quickly. But what that does is it takes away the time that a juvenile is being held, and that interruption to their life wouldn't be as severe as if it was an adult court. They're getting the services, they're getting the things, and I think that if we're looking at amenability as a factor, when we're talking about transfer, if a kid is in juvenile detention and they're doing well, and they are showing that they are amenable to the services, and they're doing everything they're supposed to do, and they're trying, and their grades have increased, and they're not having as many mental health breakdowns or situations, or they're managing their anger and all of those things. Then we have a different child when we're thinking about whether they should be in adult court or juvenile court, because we've shown them that with these services and this support, this child can be somebody different than what this situation is portraying them out to be.
Yeah, super helpful. So appreciate laying out the process, because I think, again, a lot of people don't know all the nuances of the process. So what I want to do now, I want to play a video. It's about 10 minutes long on this issue. It's an exchange that I had with TJ Smith from WBAL Radio. And I'm gonna say some words of appreciation, because a lot of times the networks that have that perspective that TJ represents tend not to have folks like me on to challenge. So I'm a big shout out to TJ Smith just on this end of it, of even having the conversation. I want to play the video, and then Bobby, I'm gonna start with you in terms of reacting to the video. So Candace, cue the video up.
Switching gears, wanted to speak with Davon Love of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. You've heard him on our show before, talking about juvenile reform efforts here in the state of Maryland. And with the General Assembly in session right now, there's more work to be done when it comes to that. And good afternoon to you, Davon.
Hey, thanks for having me on, TJ.
Indeed. So this juvenile reform session, or the session during this session, some more juvenile reform efforts are going to be coming up. Senator Will Smith is leading one of those efforts, and it's something we spoke about before, and that's to start all juveniles in the juvenile system first before they're charged as an adult for egregious crimes, quite frankly. We're talking about 14 and 15-year-olds that can be charged with murder and rape, and then 16 and 17-year-olds murder, rape, and add robbery and carjacking to it. And that's something that I know that you are for, that particular bill, and are opposed to juveniles starting in the adult system.
Yeah, I think so. A few things. One, I think it's important for your listeners to be clear about the fact that none of the proposals that folks who advocate on my side ideologically it isn't the case that we aren't interested in young people who harm folks being held accountable. That's something that I've heard in the characterizations of those that are interested in that policy. What we are clear about is that 85% of the young people in the adult prison system end up having their charges dismissed, or most of them being waved back down to the juvenile system anyway. And I think a part of what happens is that, and I'm sure you know this in your time working in law enforcement, which is that a charge, there are a variety of circumstances that contribute to what lands an extreme or violent crime on a person's charge sheet. So if a person is charged with murder, I had a conversation with a legislator this week who was telling me about a situation where their friend ran over somebody, caused them to be killed, but they ran over them because they were defending themselves against a person who had an AK in front of them because they were going after their kids, and that person was charged with murder. Those kinds of circumstances happen way more. And what we have is
That's a unique circumstance. That doesn't happen way more. That's a unique circumstance.
So we talked about this
self-defense.
So we talked about this last time, and I think this is something that I think is a pivotal part of contestation in terms of the narrative about violence and crime in Baltimore and across the state of Maryland, which is that there's national evidence. We still need to work on getting some local evidence, but there's national data that the majority, for instance, of young people that carry firearms carry them because they're afraid and feel the need to protect themselves. Right. That is evidence that we see nationally. I would bear to say that those who work most directly with young people, talking to attorneys that represent youth, talking to people like We Are Us and some of those other organizations, Baltimore Brothers today, that work directly with young people, that is what I hear anecdotally, at least from folks that work most closely with them. So what I would want your listeners to be clear about is that this is about ensuring that when a young person who is incarcerated, right, that they're incarcerated in an environment that is best suited for them, and being in the adult prison system doesn't do that. One quick correction to your characterization of the bill, because while your characterization of the bill is actually what I do support, I support fully studying them all in the juvenile system. That's actually not Senator Smith's bill. His bill actually retains some of those more egregious crimes, right? And I quite honestly, in a capitulation to those on your side of the fence, to try to moderate it. So, and my advice to him is actually to go in the other direction. So I just wanted to clarify that his bill actually retains some of those more egregious crimes.
I mean, but all of them are egregious. All of them. Every single one of them. There's not a non-egregious one that a juvenile can be charged with. Rape, murder, robbery, carjacking.
They're 33. They're 33,
but that includes the attempts thereof. That's only for 16 and 17-year-olds. It's only murder, rape, the attempts thereof, carjacking, and handgun offenses.
Gun possession, assault.
Handgun offenses. Yeah,
right.
What assault? What assault? No, it's not true.
First degree assault is automatically in the adult system.
And again, that is bodily harm, serious bodily harm.
Right.
That again, but why is it so much? I'm curious, and I don't think it's this my side versus your side. It's not that at all. I think it's your side that makes it seem like it's this other world, this other side. We're much closer on this issue than not, and it's this world of the conflation of information of these kids are carrying guns because they're scared. It's a lot of people that carry guns that have permits that you never see them until there's a need to see them. Why are you seeing them on the kids that are carrying because they're scared? Are they pulling them out? I just think that's absolute load of crap. It's a load of crap.
A kid that lives in a community that they know other people have.
I've seen it. I worked in those communities. They aren't carrying them because they're scared.
Yeah, it's just not true.
They're carrying them because they're criminals.
Wow, that's not true. That's not true. There are lots of kids who otherwise would be good kids, right? Otherwise who are kids that...
What about the good kids that aren't carrying the guns?
Right, but I'm saying good kids in neighborhoods where they feel like they're unsafe and they know other people have them.
Why hard to protect the kids that are making other parents childless?
So that is a distortion. I'm saying
it's not a distortion. That's really what happens.
I am saying that those kids who are otherwise good kids, many of them who might carry firearms because they are afraid. They walk through neighborhoods where there are other people in gangs, right? Or walk through neighborhoods where there are other folks that are engaged in activities that they don't want to be engaged in, but they, as a rational decision, they may say, okay, I need to carry a firearm to protect myself. And I'm not saying to condone that, but I'm saying that is the reality and that our policies are structured in a...
Some do that. I do believe some do that, but that is the exception of the whole, and it feels like we want to shift policy for that exception.
It's not the exception.
I do get that some should not. I don't agree that any person or kid should go to jail when they shouldn't. But under those circumstances, you're also taking a calculated risk that I know if I get caught with it, I'm going to go to jail.
Right. And what I'm saying is that I don't want those kids in adult prison. That those kids that make the rational choice to say, you know what, I'm unsafe, I'm going to carry a firearm. I think that is a rational decision. And the only evidence that does exist, like I said, there is some work locally to see what the evidence is locally. But the only evidence that does exist in terms of national studies that have been conducted say the majority of young people who carry firearms carry them because they are afraid because other people have them.
And those numbers could be different in the city compared to the rest of the country.
These are studies that have been done about cities around the country. So part of what I'm saying is that there is a need, but part of what I want to stress, though, you feel very strongly about your characterization of those who carry firearms. What I'm saying is that is not based on any empirical data, and that law enforcement that argues your side of the question, there is no empirical data. It's similar to when law enforcement says, we need to conduct these traffic stops to find firearms. So we need to be able to use the smell of cannabis in order to pull people to get firearms. But there's no data on how many firearms they recover, how many of those firearms are connected to an actual crime. So what I'm saying is that on the side of those who are resistant to the policy, what I'm saying is that the empirical data is actually on my side of the question in terms of why it is that young people are carrying firearms. And I have to mention that we're talking majority Black kids, like Black kids who are in the system and 529 young people in 2024 were charged as adults that were waved back down to the juvenile system. That's 529 kids who the system said didn't belong in the adult prison system that now are going to have a life of trauma as a result of the dehumanization of being in the adult prison system. I think that those kids are just as much victims as those that are carjacked or robbed. I think they're both victims.
The dehumanization is the fact that somebody was on the victimization end of that weapon or the beatdown or the murder or whatever it is, and the parents who ultimately have to bury their child or whatever it might be. It's two ends to this, and we agree on that. Again, it's not a your side and this side. One of the things that it frustrates me when we have these conversations, because it seems to be so much on suspects in these cases and so little on victims. What about victims? What about the people who are suffering? And what about like the boys' collegiate school here in Baltimore? I didn't hear you guys say anything about that.
So
there's a bunch of black boys that go to that school and it's closing down, and a bunch of black men like myself and like C4, like State's Attorney Ivan Bates, have spoke out. You didn't write an op-ed on that. Why not?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things we work on is a Baltimore Rites of Passage initiative that works with young boys. So there are a variety of issues on black boys that we've engaged in. So that's one effort of many. But to your point, here's the thing that I want to emphasize. Victims. Those 529 kids.
They're not all victims. They're not all victims. Just because they got way back to juvenile, they're not all victims.
See, this is part of black kids. There's a societal neglect and disregard for the humanity of black youth because of the stigmas we have about them being inherently criminal, not interested in doing the right thing. I think those stigmas impact those young people and make it so they're suffering.
The juvenile system for adjudication doesn't make them a victim. It makes them a suspect, and it makes them a criminal suspect in the juvenile system. Can we agree to that?
No, it makes them a victim of the adult prison system where the dehumanization they face is something that many of us wouldn't last an hour.
They were a suspect first because they committed a crime that put them in the system.
They were alleged to have committed a crime.
But the charges would have been dropped completely. Am I wrong?
No, well, sometimes they are. Sometimes they are. I'm saying that the allegations typically are for more complex circumstances than a good kid, bad kid.
And our last minute, really quickly, what do you hope for in this legislative session as far as juvenile reform efforts coming out? Is this Will Smith bill the only one referenced to juvenile services?
Well, for us, this is the biggest one because there's so many kids that are subject to the adult prison system. So this is the one that we're going to be pushing on the strongest.
Okay. Anything else going on with juveniles this session that is important that you want to get out real quick?
Nah, I mean that's going to be a heavy lift. The automatic charge of youth as adults has been a piece of legislation that's been put in for the past 15 years. So, I'm grateful to be in a position where we think that we're going to make some headway in ending this dehumanizing practice that impacts majority black kids that otherwise don't have a voice.
The dehumanization practice of making people victims as well.
Both are important.
We have to focus on the people who are made victims, which puts them in the position of being in the adult or juvenile system.
People hear those stories. The kids I'm talking about, people don't hear those stories. They hear the stories about the adults that you and people on this network bring up. Right. I'm saying they both matter. I'm saying they both matter. I'm saying they both matter. Those kids that are in those adult prison facilities where they're having to share underwear and being freezing cold, both of those matter.
That matters. They deserve humanity when they're incarcerated, but we have to focus on the reason they ended up there. That's making people victims. Always appreciate your willingness to have these conversations, and we'll talk again soon.
All right. So I'm gonna bring you in, Bobby, because I think one of the key points that I was trying to make during that interview is this: when we talk about, like, people say victims, right? And there's a way that the suffering of the kids who are in these adult facilities, there's a way that it's almost like not that serious. Like, it seems to be one of those things where, people find it excusable that young people are exposed to the system. So if you can say a little bit about just the examples, and not using names, but like scenarios where young people have been in the adult prison system, and kind of tease out, like, what are some of the ways that you've seen that impact young people that you work with?
Absolutely. I it goes to what Tierra mentioned earlier about trauma. Tierra and I worked together a lot on cases, and I recall one of our early cases where the young man who was being charged as an adult was actually a victim of a shooting, a year prior. And then just to explain my role with collaborating with the public defender's office, it's my job to conduct a series of clinical interviews with the youth that's being charged as adult, as well as collateral interviews. We're talking about interviews with parents, mom, dad, caregivers, mentor, etc. Those can speak to who that individual is, who the youth is beyond the charge that on the paper. And I do a trauma assessment. I do a series of different clinical assessments, trying to get an understanding of the trauma that this youth has experienced. And more often than not, and this is what troubles me in these type of conversations, because it's a lot that people don't know, that a lot of our youth are dealing with complex trauma, right? We throw around the word trauma and it's a cute little buzzword in some circles, but people don't know the depth and how serious it really is. And I tell people, even a person that's holding a gun is traumatized. And speaking to the youth that I worked with, Tierra with early on, this youth was a victim of gun violence as well. And there's been a series of various cases that I've had where the youth were victims themselves, right? So if you are a victim of gun violence yourself, where you've been shot, uh, and other people, you've lost friends, peers to gun violence, and the city of Baltimore and other places in the state. Naturally, what is going to be your response? They call it a traumatic response, either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? And then you've been socialized in the environment that, okay, how do you resolve conflict? How do you address conflict in your neighborhood? And how do you prevent the same thing that's happened to your friends or happened to you previously? How do you prevent that from happening again? And for some youth, the answer is picking up a gun. And I call that a traumatic response. Or how do I protect myself? And people oftentimes in these conversations don't have a patience to unpack that and address that and understand it, when from the time you were 10 years old, having gunshots outside of your home, your father being incarcerated and a victim of gun violence, which I've had before with a youth in my case. So he was a victim of gun violence, and his father was a victim of gun violence, right? So the gun violence it becomes somewhat normal in your community and in your family. With people being impacted by gun violence. And so when you decide to pick up a gun yourself, it could be a traumatic response in order to, how do I keep myself safe? How do I prevent this from happening again? So I think within this conversation, we don't do enough to unpack how do we get here in the first place. And then it's my job as a panel social worker on a case to figure that out, what happened in this child's life that led up to this very point. And gun violence is just one example. I had youth that have been victims of sexual assault that has never been treated before. I want to mind you, folks, of that. Gun violence, sexual violence, etc., that they never received treatment for. Nobody really even talked to them about what happened to help them process that they almost lost their life, right? Or their friend that they witnessed that died in front of them. No one talks to them about this because we're still breaking down, trying to normalize mental health in our communities. So they don't have the space, the safe space to unpack and address what they've already seen in their young lives. And oftentimes that conversation don't happen until they are detained in one of Maryland facilities. And that's problematic, that people, yes, no one wants crime. Everyone wants to be safe, right? Even an individual that has committed a crime allegedly wants to feel safe. But we don't unpack that. Well, how did it get here in the first place? And that's my job with working with folks like Tierra, Davon, is to try to tell that story of what led up to this point where I've had youth, like I said, been victims of sexual assault, victims of gun violence, experience extreme poverty, dealing with homelessness, right? And then there's my experience as well. I've heard judges on the stand, on the bench themselves, say they know that the youth is not going to get the support they need in adult services. They said it themselves. It's on record. I've heard a judge say that in Baltimore City, that they know the youth is not going to get the support they need. that pretty much they're going to be warehoused, right? Where they're not going to receive the trauma treatment that is necessary. And we have such a very minimal understanding of trauma and how it impacts the body, how it impacts the mind, and how it impacts the behavior, especially a developing mind of a youth. And I believe that is the part of the conversation that is often is missed. Mental health is not an add-on. It's not, something like a coat or a hoodie you could take off and put it on when you get cold. Mental health is a part of who you are, your entire being as an individual. And we oftentimes dismiss or minimize what happens when an individual experiences these different types of traumatic events within their trauma, within their lifetime, particularly a child from age 10 to 16.
And just to follow up, and Interior, if you got examples of this, jump in. Like, can you say a little bit to the audience about like what are some of the ways that the adult prison system itself produces trauma? Because I think for some people it's like abstract, like, they in prison, they did wrong. Like, can you say a little bit about like, and if you have some scenarios or things that young people you've encountered have dealt with as a result of being housed in the adult prison system?
Well, what I will say, because my focus is I come in while the youth prior to their transfer hearing, as Tierra mentioned, which will decide whether or not they wave up or wave down. So that is my entry point and where I focus in with trying to support and provide the necessary information for the attorneys working on the case. But it's no secret that particularly when you talk about trauma treatment, these type of services are not available in an adult system. So the question needs to be asked: at what point did this youth receive the type of support and services? If we're going to have a conversation about rehabilitation and what that looks like, how can that happen efficiently and effectively if the youth that's entering adult services does not have access to trauma treatment, delectable behavior therapy, etc.? If they do not have access to treatment as a part of their rehabilitation, how are they supposed to successfully integrate into society? Because folks tend to forget they're coming back home, right? And if we didn't do our due diligence with preparing them for that transition back home, then we're only adding to the problem. As I just said, I had a youth that experienced homelessness, youth that experienced sexual assault, as well as youth that experienced gun violence. And the first time they're talking about it is when they're in the juvenile system. And even then, it's a struggle and it's difficult for them to talk to me about it. They may mention that, yes, it happened, but feel very uncomfortable opening up. And as a clinician, I know that takes time to build the level of rapport so they can feel comfortable with sharing little by little. But it's very difficult for a lot of youth, difficult for anyone to share a traumatic event such as that. And for that to go untreated, I say if they are waived up, because the services aren't available in the adult system. So at what point in time does the rehabilitation supposed to start so they can integrate back into society? And these are the important questions that we're not asking. We're just saying, hey, they need to be held accountable, and we need to lock them up and throw away the key. And my question to folks with that argument: then what? Then what? Because they're coming back to Sandtown, they're coming back to Park Heights, they're coming back to Randallstown, Milford Mill, etc. Once they are released, then what? And if we did not invest in our communities and prepare our communities for that transition, and they certainly didn't get the treatment that they need in an adult system, then they only coming back to the same thing over and over again. And this time they are an adult when that happens. The same conditions, the same situation, repeating itself, a cycle of trauma. And that's clearly problematic.
You want to add to that, Tierra?
Well, yeah, I want to add to that, but I also want to just discuss that interview for a second. And it kind of took me back to some of my worst times in court when I felt just so enraged and just wanted to get my point out to the judge about a particular kid. And the issue is that I feel like oftentimes the judges aren't understanding or don't have the knowledge about the communities that they're actually serving. About why kids are carrying guns. That shouldn't be that shouldn't be the time for me to educate you on that while we're in a transfer hearing where we're supposed to be talking about this particular kid. I shouldn't have to make arguments about why you're confused about why they're carrying a gun. Okay, their uncle has a gun, their neighbor has a gun. If people have guns and that's what's going on in your community, you're going to carry a gun. And as Bobby said a couple minutes ago, if most of these kids are victims of trauma, they've had their own situations, they've had their own run-ons. And why are you confused at the fact that because they were robbed, now they want to carry a gun? That makes perfectly logical sense to me. And so now I'm taking time trying to explain it to you when really you should be in tune with the population that you're serving. So I think that's one point I wanted to make. And then
and real quick,
yeah.
before you do your next point, I think that's such an excellent point for the listeners to be clear about, that the fact that you are in court having to explain to judges why these young people would carry firearms, where those of us that know these kids and know these communities, it is rational. It's like, of course they're gonna carry it, and that don't mean we like it,
Right?
You know what I mean? But it's like we know they do. We know why they do. And you know what I mean? So I think that's a really important point for the listeners to key in on.
Yeah. And also, I think that judges are also extremely influenced by the media and what's being portrayed on the news. So when they have a kid that kind of fits that bill for something that they've seen on the news, or maybe they've seen that case on the news, they are directly impacted by what they do and the decisions that they make, because they take the nature of the offense and public safety at the highest regard, when really that's not what they're supposed to be considering with the most impact, right? Like we could talk about it. Like there's no statement of facts that I've read where I've been like, whoa, that wasn't so bad. No, they're bad, right? Like that's why they're charged, because they're bad statement of facts. And so we have to kind of change our thinking about how we approach these cases and look at it individually and look at amenability, look at the trauma, look at each kid. And that's what we're supposed to be doing, but that's not what's happening in the courtroom. So that's why it's going to be important for us to flip the switch, to have it on juvenile judges who know that that's what they should be doing, right? Adult judges, they hear these things, they're like, oh, I'm in adult court and I know that adults are doing it and I don't want kids to do it. So they're trying to deter them from doing it by keeping them in adult system. And that's not really the way to do it. That's my first thing. I think my second thing is I heard him talk about egregious crimes. Like we want to retain egregious crimes or something. And so I think one thing to discuss right there is overcharging. Right. And so when we're talking about overcharging, that means that, yes, the kid may be charged with attempted first degree murder, but was this really attempted first degree murder? Did they just shoot up in the air? Like, what are we talking about here? Right. And so I think people don't realize a lot of those charges are dropped because they have to charge them in the beginning. Right. And so judges are reading these charges, they see the charges, and we don't really get to dispute them. Right? Like the police report is what the police report is at the transfer process. We don't get to say like, well, Your Honor, he was just standing on the side. And even if you get to say it, the judge still hears what they want to hear from the police report. Right? So I think that we need to talk about that. Like a lot of these cases are overcharged. And if they were just charged the way they should have been charged in the beginning, half of these cases wouldn't be in adult court. And that's what happens. We usually go for the charge that makes the most sense. Like the state's attorney says, I can't prove this, but I can prove this. And that's going to put them back in juvenile court. So I'm going to agree. And that's what happens a lot of the time. I wanted to talk about what happens when a juvenile case stays in adult court and they're under 18. If they're under 18, then they will go to the youth detention center. At the youth detention center is basically just a housing place. They have school, right? That's it. They don't have any counseling, individual therapy. The only time you are afforded some type of counseling services is if you are in a medical crisis, in a crisis, right? So if you're in a crisis and something's going on, then you will offer some type of counseling services. But other than that, the type of trauma-informed care that has been recommended in those transfer reports and been recommended by our evaluators and our social workers and people who worked on a case and got to know this kid are not being given, right? That does not exist. So they would stay at YDC until they're 18, and then they would be transferred over to whatever adult detention facility they're assigned to. And at that facility, one thing, and this is something that I've recently learned, because I don't have a lot of kids that go to adult court because I think I'm good at my job and I try to keep everybody down. But what happens is if you go to a adult facility, and let's say for instance you have had an IEP your whole life, you've had maybe a 504 plan, and you've always had assistance in school, then when you go to the adult facility, the only option for schooling is a GED. Now, if a kid has had an IEP since the 5th grade, there's no way possible that this kid is going to be able to obtain a GED in an adult facility without help or assistance. So we have a kid that may or may not have their GED. And in order to qualify for good time credits in an adult facility, like, and to get, like, let's say you want to do a work program, you have to have a GED. So we're automatically setting our kids up for failure by putting them in an adult system, knowing they're not going to be able to attain a GED, and knowing that a GED is a requirement in order for them to get less time on their sentence. Now that's a fact right there. That's a little tea that I had just learned about when we had a credit class. But I'm like, you know, we are setting them up regardless of what we do if we have them in adult court, right from the very beginning. So when I see those types of interviews where people are like, well, what about the victims? What about this? As Mr. Bobby said, they're going to come back into the community. And what type of person do you think they're going to be after they spent significant amount of time in their developmental period in a facility learning different skills? I'll call them skills, I guess, different things within these facilities to maintain themselves within the facility. What kind of person do you expect them to be when they come out into the real world? And so I think I'm always looking at the bigger picture, and I think we need to think about what happens to them further down the road, because we're creating a problem where the community wants to send these kids to jail. And I'm like, well, what's going to happen 10 years from now?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's really important, particularly the part about the fact that for a lot of these kids, like if they've needed support all this time and they don't have it, to your point, you know, they setting them up for failure. And so the other thing too, and a part of why I wanted to play the interview is because, and the part that even in the moment, it shocked me for him to say this, when he was like, kids carry guns because they're criminals. And I mean, it's like, wow, like you don't know, like, are you around people who work with youth? You know what I'm saying? Because I don't hear people that work with youth say that, right? And I know examples of young people that have carried firearms who it's like, oh, that's not even a kid that's built like that to use it. Like, I imagine y'all deal with a bunch of kids who in real life, it's like, I'm tougher than you. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, we're not dealing with like these hardened criminals, but I think that's the narratives that people are given over and over and over again. So I want to break that down a little bit, particularly this concept of like, these are bad kids, right? Because I think one of the things, and your overcharging point, right, where what ends up on a person's, there are a lot of circumstances that impact what ends up on a person's charge sheet that may or may not have anything to do with what actually happened, right? So, you know, you kind of alluded to examples of like, I'm in a car and somebody that I'm in a car with got a gun, right? Or things like me and my crew get into an argument with this other crew, you know what I'm saying? And I got a gun on me because I don't know if they have it. And then we have a situation that just spins out of control, right? These ain't kids that's like, we trying to do this, right? This is like, it just happens, the normal course of young people navigating the world. And I think that what happens is that the media puts out these extreme stories, and then when they hear, oh, this is a kid with a gun, they automatically go to, well, this is a criminal, and they go to, and most of them kids that's locked up as criminals. So if you could break that down a little bit, like break down for those who are listening, like what is the typical profile of the young person who is being automatically put into the adult system? Either one of y'all can do that.
Okay. I guess, well, I wouldn't say that there's a profile, Devon, just because I look at each case individually, right? And so each individual client that I have has had their own struggles within just being a child, right? And just trying to figure out, I think I wouldn't say they're a bad child, but I would say they're troubled, and not troubled by them personally, but troubled by the outside things in the community, right? Just troubled by the fact that there's extreme pressure being a kid, right? There's social media, there's music, there's so many ways where you can be impacted and influenced. I think that it creates a situation where um, there's extreme pressure. Just being a 16-year-old in general, I'm sure it's hard. I remember being in high school, and it's a tough period for anybody, right? And you're trying to find people who have the same interests as you, people who are doing the same things as you. And oftentimes when we are lacking, I, we like to talk about food. What is it? Food, shelter,
Clothing, shelter.
clothing,
Absolutely.
shelter. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when any of those things are absent or not readily available to a person, that
Mhm.
impacts them, right? And so I think it's the same thing with kids, right? So like you don't have family, so you're looking for family. You don't have shelter, so then you may go to someone's house who you would normally go to for shelter. You don't have the clothing that you want to have, so you try to figure out how to get that type of clothing. You don't have a phone, so you think you want to get a phone from somewhere else. I think there's a lot of influence from the community that creates these situations for kids where they are troubled to try to get those things and acquire those things. And so that's why I say no kid. I don't think any kid is bad. I do think that we are, um, I would say, a derivative of our community and what we have going on. Right? You can kind of see some kids like you're like, okay, well, your mom is there, right? But then you say, okay, well, the dad is incarcerated. Okay, so mom is trying to do everything that she's trying to do. You're taking care of kids. There's a lot of things that our kids go through that, as Bobby talked about, no one knows, right? You just wouldn't know unless you ask them. And I think sometimes when we often get involved in their situations, already a little too late, and they're already involved in the criminal justice system.
And from a lot of youth, I ask the youth sometimes that I interview, like, how do we get here, man? Why you here?
Mm.
And of course it's different when you're caught up in the morning versus when you're calm. You're in a space where you can actually process logic. And oftentimes what I hear, like, man, I don't know, man, I was just doing some dumb ish. That's really no real justification as to why. And what I find oftentimes when interviewing youth is definitely peer pressure, as you heard Tierra say, that we all succumb to at one point or another, being teenagers. Whether, hey, I got the latest pair of shoes on, or hey, I got the latest this or whatever. Succumbing to peer pressure. So you may have a youth that wasn't about that life, wasn't like that, but hanging around individuals that are involved in high risk behavior, and somebody get the bright idea that, hey, that's still a car, or let's take this person's cell phone, because it doesn't fit the description. It's too simplistic, as in what TJ said of what it is criminals. Like, no, you're dealing with impulsive teenagers that when they get around other impulsive teenagers, um, uh, to some extent they are succumb to peer pressure and high risk behavior. High risk behavior, again, there's juvenile. We all can fit the description of juvenile delinquent behavior to an extent. And that includes cutting class, that includes smoking weed, that includes having unprotected sex. All of that is high risk behavior. And I'm not minimizing the behavior, but what I am doing is speaking to how common it is with all of us at one point in time as youth succumb to high risk behavior, that we don't look at, and then fall into a situation where you have a youth that goes too far. When I was a youth, I succumbed to peer pressure and tried to steal a magazine from a supermarket before. The silly stuff, not thinking about the long-term consequences. And yeah, I knew better. Was I a bad kid? No, absolutely not. I wasn't a bad kid, and I didn't call myself a criminal either. But impulsive behavior by a teenager, and not thinking about the long-term consequences, a lot of our youth not considering, and succumbing to peer pressure. And sometimes it just goes way too far. It's not, oh, hey girl, I'm gonna get the latest skirt, or how what these pair of shoes are going to look like Saturday night when we go out. And for some folks, they go as far as that, and then for others, they say, "Yeah, man, I'm about to go rob this person for the cell phone. Come on," and you'll go along with it, just because that's your homeboy, that's your friend that you're with all the time. So it's just not as simplistic as saying they're a criminal. I think we're lacking an understanding of youth development. We're
Mhm.
lacking an understanding of environments, particularly urban environments and communities. We're not taking accountability to society of these vices that we make available. Like youth don't make guns available. Adults make guns available. So that's not on youth. You live in a society where the Second Amendment is coveted. So therefore, you have easy access to guns. And as I have youth that struggle with trying to find a job, they talk to me about their struggles of trying to find a job and the pressures they have from their parents trying to find a job. Guess what? Getting a gun is a lot easier than getting a job out here these days. And it's these societal factors that we do not have the patience to consider and to address. And we fall to simplistic statements such as they carry guns because they're criminals, and that's just not the case. It's a lot more complex than that, coupled with a trauma that a child may experience. Because I never been a victim of gun violence, so I can't say what I'll do if I'm ever shot. If I'm shot, I know I'm fearful when I see ICE shoot people on TV. I'm very fearful of trying to navigate the environment, society. So I can only imagine what goes through a youth mind if they are a victim of gun violence. And that's something that we don't consider. We're talking impulsive behavior by youth, coupled with the trauma, adverse child experiences they could have experienced in their lifetime. And we don't see that. That's what goes deeper than the charges that are on a piece of paper.
Mm. And so last question for y'all. This one of the things that y'all heard me in the beginning talk about Sinclair Broadcasting and just the nature of their propaganda and all of that. And I'm on the record as saying that they are a right-wing advocacy organization masquerading as a media company, right? That's in essence what they are. And they put out several stories on this issue over the past couple of weeks since the changes in leadership that I talked about in the beginning.
Mhm.
Like they've been putting out story after story after story, trying to discourage people. And one of the things that has been a challenge on these kinds of issues is some of our elders,
Mhm.
right? Like some of our elders who watch the propaganda,
Mhm.
and even some who don't, who carry attitudes that are like, yeah, lock them up. And some of the attitudes make sense given some of their experience. Sometimes like their car may have been stolen. You know what I'm saying? Or a person they know, was robbed, right? And so much of the propaganda is then amplified by just some of those experiences that some of our elders have. I've actually seen some studies that show that Sinclair's propaganda is impactful on Black viewership. Like there are Black people who will tell me, and like I've been to community association meetings where what comes up is, what are y'all gonna do about juvenile crime? Quote unquote juvenile crime.
Mhm.
So if you could just simulate, what are the things that you would say in a room full of our elders, right, who struggle with this issue? Like, how would you approach addressing them and getting them to understand that this policy of automatically charging youth as adults don't make them more or less safe? You know what I mean? Like, how would you address? Because that's one of the things that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out, at LBS is like, because we know the Republicans, the right wingers, the prosecutors, law enforcement, they, they're our political opposition anyway on a variety of things. But our elders sometimes are often brought in, right? Or, are brought in ways that they're exploited. Like their suffering is exploited for the
Absolutely.
purposes of supporting this right wing agenda. And I'm sure you both have, had to interact, with older Black folks that have a particular perspective on this. What would you say, right? How would you approach that?
Davon, it's a difficult conversation, right? Because yes, that level of social conservatism does exist in the Black community. And to your point, and as somebody with a media background, brother, I've been seeing it happen for years of how platforms such as Fox 45 drives a narrative. We've seen it with the Squeezy Boys, right? And that's how you perpetuate fear and these racist tropes about black youth, and how harmful that can be for the general public, because you're feeding the public one-sided narratives of black youth, and looking past the understanding that this is your grandson, these are your nephews, these are your sons that are in your own family, in your own communities, and validating these fears again and again and again with these news stories, man. It becomes very troubling and difficult to have the conversations because folks come to the table with their preconceived notions that child is problematic, that child needs to be locked away. But I will say that education, as always, is necessary. Um, Understanding that, yes, we all want public safety. That youth want public safety, believe it or not, and having this dynamic of us against them is not helpful. It's never been helpful to our communities, and we've seen this tough on crime, zero tolerance approach before when Martin O'Malley was mayor. And ushered in those broken window policies from New York, and how throughout decades black community has suffered tremendously from these type of policies, yet and still no real results. We continue to have the same challenges, and we're talking about when three of us were all kids, this was happening, and here we are, full grown adults, and these quote unquote problems persist. And it's due to platforms like Fox 45 feeding the propaganda of the evil black demon coming to destroy your life. That though is problematic, to say the least. Friends don't let friends watch Fox. First of all, it's poison to the mind. But definitely having these type of conversations. I remember a story that Fox put out where Ivan Bass, Baltimore City State's Attorney Ivan Bass, was canvassing the community with elders such as Lawrence Bell, etc., and talking about Squeezy Boys being on the corner. Not the Squeezy Boys were robbing people or anything like that, but just the fact that they're there, their presence was troubling them. And I don't think Ivan Bass is the one to have these type of conversations, first of all. But having conversations with folks that work with youth, and hearing their concerns, validating their concerns. Like, yes, we all want safety, but we have to understand what's happening, first of all, with our youth, and educating them on these type of challenges. And how do we achieve? And you have so many examples out there. You said it today, a family, B. Ropey, so many I am mentality, so many people that work with youth tirelessly. Mama K, Mama Rashida, the list goes on tirelessly. Been working with youth for generations in the city. That can speak to the transformation of power of Baltimore youth specifically. And I would say these are the people that our elders need to hear from in a community setting and platform, and also hear from our youth, hear from the youth that we work with, the ones that are constantly demonized. And it sickens me when I see it. It constantly demonized on platforms like Fox 45 and others. So I think more than anything, education is needed, and the right people being in the room to have these conversations. Because if you don't work with youth, you're not qualified to have the conversations. You're just not. You have poor insight, and you're misinformed. So first of all, being in the room with youth, being in the room with people who work with youth, to have conversations with elders. They are the ones that need to be in the room as we work together collectively to figure out what does public safety look like for us without the heavy hand of the police. And we can achieve that because we have achieved that. We've seen what's happening with the homicides in Baltimore. That's being led by community-based efforts, community-led efforts, people who come from these communities. That's being led by them. We are Safe Streets, Baltimore Peace Movement. It's being led by people like that are making an impact and a difference, that wants better. That is public safety in my perspective here in Baltimore. And I believe they are the type of folks that need to be at the table having the conversations with our elders about that, and also elders that we are connected with. Baba Olamina comes to mind. Baba Olamota comes to mind, that have extensive track record with working with you. Mama K, Mama Shit, having conversations with elders that have a significant track record with working with youth as well, so they can hear from other elders why we must take a different direction.
And I'll piggyback off of that. I think the main things that elders want to see is, and I think this is for everybody, mainly accountability, right? Like everyone throws out this word accountability. I just want them to be held accountable for the things that they do and be held accountable. But I think that when we're looking at holding people accountable, we need to talk about that accountability being proportional and reasonable to each individual person. We can't just automatically say that every juvenile needs to be in jail, right? Like that can't be the answer. That's not the solution. And so we have to kind of change our approach when we're talking about accountability. There's a way to hold people accountable in juvenile court that's appropriate for each and every kid, right? Like it can be, it's going to be narrowly tailored to that kid. And so I don't know why we sometimes just automatically think that jail is the appropriate decision without even trying all of the other ways that we can help effectuate change within these kids. So I think that when we are educating our elders and educating our community and having these types of sessions and talks about how it works, because a lot of people don't really know how it works until their kid is the one that's detained, and I'm on the phone with them for hours trying to explain the process to them, and they're crying, and then I talk to the kid and they're crying. So no one really gets that personal one-on-one with them except for attorneys, social workers, people who are in the process, and we know how this system is directly impacting them, right? And so I think people in the community need to hear more from people like us. I'm not trying to influence anyone. I'm just telling you exactly how it goes, right? And what I'm hoping is that when when we have those conversations and we talk about it, and then you say, okay, yes, this kid, their brain is developing, they're not making good decisions, they don't know what they're doing, right? And so we take that into consideration instead of just automatically saying that they should be in jail. I think when we start to explain that to the community, and the more the community is educated about what's really happening, and not just looking at what's on the news, because of course the media, they portray the most serious of the serious, right? And sometimes, like one thing that we don't often talk about is accomplice liability, when someone's just the getaway driver, or someone's just someone who's standing on the side. They can be held accountable for whatever someone else does, right? And so that's a huge law that affects juveniles, when really that juvenile isn't even really involved in the situation. So I think we just need to start digging a little deeper and stop taking things on the surface, right? Because of course they've been telling us how things are supposed to be and how they should be and how they're not right for a long time. So we need to do our own research and our own investigation into why our kids are like this. I think it's our responsibility to do that. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure that if we are holding people accountable, it's in a way that makes sense.
Well, look, I really appreciate y'all, taking this time to explain all of this to the community. I think that, again, it's an issue that we've talked about, LBS has talked about a lot. And it's just really good to have like an attorney and a social worker talk people through, like, what's actually happened with our young people. So appreciate the work that y'all do. Continue to do the work that y'all do for our people in our community. Always, if there's anything that LBS can do to support and help with the work that you all doing, don't hesitate to reach out. Appreciate y'all, a lot. And I'll see y'all around.
Appreciate all your work, LBS.
LBS.
Lawrence, Candace, everyone, Lady B, all of you all, your advocacy and shedding the light on this important topic, brother. I can't thank you enough for all the work you do for all of us, brother. I really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Yeah, appreciate y'all. Appreciate y'all. All right, fam. So, hopefully that conversation was something that for those who may be on the fence or trying to understand this automatically charging this adults issue, hopefully that gives you some additional context to the issue, and why we're fighting so hard to severely curtail and hopefully to end the practice of automatically charging these adults. So, look, to wrap up, LBS, we're a think tank, unapologetically advocate for Black people. This is an issue that impacts Black youth. And as I mentioned in the interview that we played when I was on TJ Smith's show, there's a way that the suffering of Black youth is something that is rarely ever heard. That the stories that we hear about those carjackings, right? And they're important, right? We hear about those instances where persons beat up or robbed. Those are important. We hear about that. But what we often don't hear the news media report on rather, is we don't hear them report the stories of young people who are spending 180 days in the adult prison facility, being in there, as Kiara said, for 23 hours a day in a cell, right? We don't hear about the stories of young people who, when they are caught with a gun, we don't hear the story about that, what happened to that young person. Those aren't the stories that we hear. We hear the stories of people carjacked. We don't hear the stories of the young people that are in the system. And again, as I mentioned, and as our guests, those situations are a lot more complex than what's on a charge sheet, right? And so my hope is that all those points are really helpful for people to understand the issue, and that you understand why we are so passionate about it, right? Because people say that the youth are our future, but the reality is that they can't be our future if we're okay with our young people being dehumanized, right? And a young person who is traumatized, who's engaged in activity that might land them proximate to the criminal justice system, we need to understand that there are all these societal forces that track our community, track our young people into those systems. And there's a history of those systems being weaponized against the humanity of people of African descent. So want to thank everybody for tuning in. This is the kind of, I'm gonna say one other thing too about the nature of our advocacy on this, because I think this is important, that as an organization that is unapologetically committed and accountable to the masses of our community, sometimes what happens is that people try to find ways to engage this issue in a way that doesn't actually address the fact that Black people, particularly Black boys in this case, are the ones that are most directly impacted by this, right? And even when that does come up, there's a way that people avoid wanting to talk about those circumstances that young people are in that contribute, right, to some of the things that we see in our neighborhoods and in our community. And even less so, we see less of that in the state capitol, right? That we don't see enough of like major prominent voices that are the voice for Black youth that have the ability to push legislators. And our ability to be an organization to advocate on behalf of young people is based off the fact we're an independent Black political organization, right? So we're able to say the things that unfortunately other folks either aren't brave enough to say or aren't positioned to say in the political and legislative environment, right? And so my appeal to those watching, become a sustainer. It's a part of how we maintain our independence. There are over almost 300 people that contribute to us monthly. And that helps to provide the basis for us to continue to provide this content and the advocacy that we engage in. So please, sign up to be a sustainer. If you can't be a sustainer, sign up to be on our email listserv, right? Because we will send out action alerts, and you're going to see us put out action alerts where you can contact your legislator and urge them to, pass this piece of legislation. And that's something that might seem small, but makes a big difference in terms of how legislators engage us. And it gives legislators the impression that if they don't, take seriously our demands, that there'll be some political consequences that come as a result of not heeding the demands that we put forward. So my hope is that you all either can become a sustainer, join our email listserv, so you can help us fight for the humanity of Black children who unfortunately don't have very many voices in the political landscape, but will unapologetically advocate for them in a white supremacist environment that the society is. So thanks for tuning in. See you soon. Peace.